All right, you guys know the drill. We're going to be taking our unit circles so we can see where the points came from in this cos graph. So the input is the angle that I'm going to be using. The output is going to be the ratio, which is like the coordinate on the graph. Since this is a cos graph, I'm going to be looking at my x coordinates. So if I look at the x coordinates on the graph, the ones that I want to use are the ones that are easiest to graph. 1/2 isn't bad, but I'm basically going to avoid all of these, and I'm going to use the ones that are just on the quadrant lines, the 1, the 0, the -1, and so on. So if I find cos of 0 radians, cos of 0 radians is 1. Cos of pi halves radians is 0. Cos of pi radians is -1. Cos of 3 pi halves radians is 0. And cos of 2 pi radians is 1. So you can see that cos is different from sine because instead of starting and ending on the midline and having the middle point being on the midline and then having a maximum and a minimum, it actually starts and it ends on the maximums, and the middle is the minimum, and then it touches the midline in between those. So it's different. But once you graph the rest of it, once you continue the pattern, the graphs actually end up looking the same. They actually look very similar. You just get this repetitive wave. So sine and cosine graphs are almost identical except for how they start. They start a little bit differently, but once you continue the pattern, they look very much the same. So we're going to go ahead and write these points down. 0, 1. Pi halves 0, pi -1, 3 pi halves 0, and 2 pi 1. All right. So now since we're back to cosine graphs, we have amplitudes again, we have midlines again. The period now, since we're talking about cosine graphs, again, the period is going to be 2 pi. So now we're back to talking about a frequency describing the number of cycles that occur in 2 pi, from 0 to 2 pi instead of from 0 to pi, the way it was with tangent. The transformations are the same as what they were with the sine graph. So if your A is negative, then that means that the graph has been reflected over the x-axis. And so for this graph, if it was reflected over the x-axis, that would mean that we would start with the minimums. We'd go from minimum to minimum, and the maximum would be in the middle. And then, of course, we would cross the midline. We also know that the A value is the amplitude. So the amplitude is the absolute value of A, because the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top of the curve. So the maximum, it's the distance from the midline to the maximum, the distance from the midline to the minimum. So the amplitude is the absolute value of A. We know that the B value gives us the frequency of the graph. So B is the frequency. The default B value, if you just see the x alone, the default B value is 1. That means that there is one curve from 0 to 2 pi normally. If you have a 2 there, then that means you're going to see 2 of these curves from 0 to 2 pi. If there's a 3 there, you're going to see 3 of these curves from 0 to 2 pi. To find the period of the graph, we're going to use the formula 2 pi divided by the B value. The h and the k do what they've always done. So a positive h is going to shift the graph to the left. A negative h is going to shift the graph to the right. You can call that a horizontal shift, or you can call that a phase shift. Either one of those is fine. A positive k is going to shift the graph up. A negative k is going to shift the graph down. And we can call those a vertical shift. They don't call it anything different in trig functions. All right, so for the first example, we have an amplitude of 1. The period of this graph is going to be 2 pi divided by 3 because 3 is the b value. So 2 pi divided by 3. The frequency is 3. There's no number on the end of the graph, and so this graph has not shifted up or down, which means that the midline is just going to be right in the middle at 0. All right, so let's go ahead and start graphing this one. I'm going to put the x and the y-axis right in the middle. And I do think that having the x and the y right in the middle worked on all of the graphs. I don't think that I had to change that. Just like we did with sine and with tangent, it's going to work to have the period in sets of 4, 8, or 12 boxes. You don't have to change that. So I'm going to go ahead and use 4 boxes because that seemed to be the favorite when I asked you guys about this in class. So 1, 2, 3, 4 makes 4 pi thirds. 1, 2, 3, 4 makes 6 pi thirds, which is 2 pi. And then 8 pi thirds. When you graph these, you only have to have 2 cycles of the graph. So you only have to do the pattern twice, and then that's plenty. I didn't write it in the instructions for the notes, but I'm pretty sure I wrote it in the instructions for the practice. So I have a tendency to put more than enough when I draw the examples, but you only really have to have 2. So amplitude, I'm going to go ahead and go by 2 boxes. Okay, so what we're going to do, because this is a positive graph, so that means that we're going to be starting at the maximum, ending at the maximum, hitting the minimum in the middle. So I'm going to start up at the maximum with an amplitude of 1. I'm going to end at the maximum with an amplitude of 1. I'm going to hit the minimum in the middle, and then between those 2 points, I'm going to cross the midline. So maximum to maximum, minimum in the middle, cross the midline between those. Maximum to maximum, get the minimum in the middle, cross the midline between those. Maximum to maximum, get the minimum in the middle, between the points, cross the midline. Okay, now when I'm connecting my points, this should not be a zigzag. This is going to be a smooth curve. Just like the sine curve, I'm going to make these little U shapes. And I always leave the last U shape because for me it's hard to do half of a U shape. And there we go. All right, let's go ahead and flip the page. So this one has an amplitude of 2. The period of the graph is going to get larger because the b value is 1 divided by 2, it's 1/2. So we're going to have 2 pi divided by that b value. And I'm going to go ahead and do keep it, change it, flip it. And so the period of the graph is going to be 4 pi. Okay, the frequency is 1/2. There's still no number on the end, so this graph has not been shifted up or down. The midline is just at 0. I'm going to go ahead and draw the x and the y axis. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and spread this one out a little bit more since 4 pi is supposed to be a more spread out period for the graph. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes and put 2 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes, 4 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 pi. Then 8 pi. We have an amplitude of 2, but the middle is 0. Okay. Now, this is a negative graph, which means that instead of starting at the maximum and ending at the maximum, we're going to start at the minimum and end at the minimum. So I have an amplitude of 2, so I'm going to start at the minimum and end at the minimum. And then right in the middle, I'm going to go up to the maximum. Now between the points, I need to cross the midline. Cross the midline, and then I'm going to repeat the pattern again. So start at the minimum, end at the minimum. In the middle, I'm going to go up to the maximum. And then between those points, I'm going to cross the midline. So start at the minimum, end at the minimum. In the middle, go up to the maximum. Between those, cross the midline. Okay. There's my U shape. All right, example 3. The amplitude is 3. We have a 2 in the front, so 2 pi divided by 2 is pi. The frequency of this graph is 2, and this time we do have a midline change. The graph shifts up 1, so we're going to say y equals 1. I'll go ahead and draw my x and my y axis. All right, so pi, I'll go ahead and do 4 boxes. And then since my midline is at 1 and I have an amplitude of 3, I'm going to go by 1s for the y-axis here. And draw in my midline. This curve is positive, and so that means I'm going to be starting at the maximum. So here's my midline. So from the midline, I'm going to go up an amplitude of 3 and start at the maximum. So 1, 2, 3, there's my maximum. And I've got the beginning and then my maximum with an amplitude of 3. In between those, I'm going to do my minimum. So from the midline down, 1, 2, 3. And then between the maximum and the minimum, I must cross the midline. So maximum to maximum. In the middle of those, I need to have the minimum. Between those 2 points, I should cross the midline. Maximum to maximum. In the middle of those, I have my minimum. Between those 2 points, I cross the midline. And then I'll go and get my U shapes. Okay. Then let's go ahead and do this one. We have an amplitude of 1. For the period, we're going to do 2 pi divided by that b value. So keep it, change it, flip it. The pi's will cancel out, so the period of the graph is going to be 4. The frequency of the graph is going to be pi halves. The midline of the graph is going to be -1. All right, so I'm going to draw my x and y axis. And I'll go ahead and do 4 boxes. And since I have a midline at 1, -1, and an amplitude of 1, I can go ahead and scale like that. So I'll draw in my midline. This curve is negative, which means I'm going to start at my minimum. So there's my middle. I have an amplitude of 1, so I'm going to start at a minimum, an amplitude of 1 from the midline. So there's my minimum and my minimum. Between that, I've got my maximum. And then I need to cross the midline. So from minimum to minimum, between the minimums, I have my maximum, and then there's my midline. Minimum to minimum, between those, I have my maximum, cross the midline. Okay, and there's the curve. So make sure you check Google Classroom to see which points you have to do on the practice assignment.